Thank you very much for the kind introduction, and I don't think I've ever experienced a better overlap in leading to my paper before. So thank you, Teresa, for finishing your paper in the way you did, because it leads directly to my paper, which is brilliant. I've changed the title of my paper slightly. I've narrowed the topic. I'm going to talk about the post-war story of the Kurt Heißmeyer experiments. Why have I chosen that topic? I think it shows in an extreme way the post-war story of these experiments, the symptoms which characterized the dealing with medical experiments in Germany in the post-war times. And so that's very interesting, but it's also very interesting because it's actually a divided story which takes place parallelly in East Germany and West Germany, and the two stories intertwine over time. So that's also very interesting because it shows us something about the relationship between the countries at that time. So, but before I get to the post-war story of these experiments, I'm just going to quickly walk you through what actually happened in these experiments for the ones of you who are not so familiar with this topic. These experiments happened in the kind of high noon, or the end stage of the race for a weapon, a working cure and a vaccine against tuberculosis, which went on until the end of the Second World War. And this is the time when Kurt Heißmeyer, of course, did these experiments in 44 and spring 45. I looked at the World Health Organization's tuberculosis report for 2016, and apparently tuberculosis remains one of the top 10 causes of death worldwide. But of course, today it's a problem of getting the drugs to the people who suffer, which are mostly in Africa and Asia nowadays. And in these days, as most of you will know, it was one of the main medical obstacles for Europeans, and it was the problem of finding a drug in the first place. And of course, there was also a military dimension to this, as you will know. So Kurt Heißmeyer, he was not an isolated figure. He had held a post since 1933 at Hohenlychen, which had been a model sanatorium for tuberculosis since its foundation at the beginning of 20th century, 1902. But later, as many of you will know, under Karl Gebhardt, the notorious leading figure of one of the leading figures of Nazi medicine and personal physician to Heinrich Himmler, Hohenlychen had turned into a center of planning and the management of human experiments in concentration camps. So Kurt Heißmeyer, a specialist on lung disease, he wanted to capitalize on this situation, and he initially he wished to perform experiments in Ravensbrück on work therapy for tuberculosis, but that wasn't approved. So eventually in June 1944, he was allowed to experiment on concentration camp inmates in Neuengamme. This is Hohenlychen and Gebhardt. I missed this one. And this is, I know it's not a good picture, but it's the only one I have from the experimental block in Neuengamme where he did the experiments, which Neuengamme is close to Hamburg. So what did he try to actually do there? Two things. He wished to prove his hypothesis that tuberculosis was a condition linked to extortion. He called it Erschöpfungstheorie, or racial inferiority, which he linked to, of course, Jewish people and people from Eastern Europe. And his second hypothesis, that it could be cured by implementing a second artificial center of infection. I'm not going to elaborate on the quality of his research. That's a different topic, and it should be studied more, actually. So between June 1944 and April 1945, around 100 adults, male adults, who had been slave laborers in Germany and had been arrested for one reason or the other and had ended up in Neuengamme. And 20 Jewish children, we've just heard about one of them, who had come from Auschwitz, especially to be test persons for Heißmeyer, And these two groups were suspected to his experiments. He used various techniques to infect his test persons. Most of them had been completely healthy before, or at least they had not had tuberculosis at all. He injected tuberculosis into the shoulder, or he rubbed it into the skin, which he had scarred slightly before, which you can see, those little cuts on the chest. I think one can see them. Or he had infected the victims with a tube, which he inserted into the lung, which you can see on these X-rays. He ordered prisoner assistants or prisoner doctors to remove the lymphatic glands surgically from his test persons, so mostly the axillary lymph nodes, but sometimes at the neck, in order to see the extent of the tuberculosis infection. There was no therapy for the victims, only meticulous documentation. On the 20th of April 1945, with the arriving of the Allied troops, the British troops, to Neuengamme, before, of course, the 20 children and the prisoner doctors and nurses were murdered in a basement of a school in Hamburg at the so-called Bullenhuser Damm. They were not murdered by Heißmeyer, but by staff, leading staff personnel in Neuengamme. So let me get to the post-war story, and firstly to the story of the persecution, or rather non-persecution, of Heißmeyer. So what happened after the murder of the children and the end of the war? After the murder, sorry. Days after, Heißmeyer visited Neuengamme for the very last time. It was only upon his arrival, according to his testimony during the later trial, that he learned his experimental unit had been cleared, the documentation destroyed, and the children been taken away. Back in Hohenlychen, he took his personal documentation on the experiment and buried it in a metal box. He didn't want to lose that. For some months, he then went to help out his father in a small country surgery in a small town in Saxony-Anhalt. But as soon as May 1946, so 1 year later, he resettled in Magdeburg and opened a surgery under his real name as a specialist on lung disease. The very same month, so May 1946, in Hamburg, the main perpetrators of Neuengamme were trialed by the British military trial. You might have heard of the Kurierhausprozesse. Many surviving Neuengamme prisoners gave witness accounts of the experiments that happened in Neuengamme. There was a description of Heißmeyer, and his name was known to the persecutors, but his whereabouts were unknown. Magdeburg, where he was part of the Soviet zone, and Hamburg was in the British zone. The experiments were reported in the West German media during the trial, although little was known what actually happened in the experiments. But I mean, the murder of the children soon became really a symbol of the Nazi medical atrocities. In the Nuremberg trials on medical crimes, which started the same year, Heißmeyer was also named, and he was on the United Nations list for criminals since June 1948. So after that date, June 48, nothing really happened for a very long time. Heißmeyer kept on practicing in the GDR for around 15 years, until finally his past got back at him. Rumors had actually been going around colleagues in Magdeburg for quite a while, and someone actually, a colleague, identified him as the assistant of Gebhardt. So the Ministry for Staatssicherheit, the notorious Stasi, they did actually investigate into him, or they researched something, but it started in 1954 and again in 1958, but they didn't really follow through, and they heard about these rumors, but what they were really interesting was his very critical attitude towards the policies in the GDR. He openly said that he disapproved of many things, which shows his great confidence he actually had in those times. So nothing happened, no consequences took place. From the mid-50s, various publications, mostly from the Western Hemisphere, named and accused Heißmeyer as the responsible physician behind the experiments. You can see here the Stern, and then the famous book from Langley Russells, on the Nazi medical crimes. It came out in both parts of Germany. Then two publications, one publication from Hamburg, Villiez, and also actually two Polish publications, which are quite interesting because Tadeusz Kowalski, the one at the very top, he was one of the prisoner doctors involved with the Heißmeyer experiments, and he published something, a report on the experiments, stating the murder of the children in a Polish medical journal as soon as '46, but it was completely ignored. So one has to say, before Heißmeyer was finally arrested, his crimes were actually nothing but an open secret. It was nothing that no one knew about. But still, in February '59, the MFS, the Stasi, came to the conclusion that Heißmeyer could easily be arrested because of his political rebellion, but he was needed in the medical system and that he was not identical with Neuengamme's Heißmeyer. This conclusion can only be titled as a statement of denial, in my opinion. So it was only in '61 that at a meeting of physicians in Berlin, that just by coincidence really, a journal from, an educational journal from Hamburg called Der Flüger was circled and coincidentally got into the hands of a Stasi agent who happened to be present. He recognized Heißmeyer as the lung specialist practicing in Magdeburg and reopened the files, and the investigation was started again. And so finally, in December '63, he was arrested. This is this document for his arrest, and you can see Mielke's signature at the top. So let me get to the post-war story of the test persons. So when the legal pursuit of the Heißmeyer case was shaped by the post-war climate in politics, so was really the memory of the victims. It was only really when the legal prosecution was finished in the mid-60s that an interest evolved at all about the identities of the victims. During the trials in Nuremberg and later in Nuremberg and Hamburg, victims were mentioned, but none of them were traced down to testify. They couldn't find one personally. Of course, the children were dead. The Heißmeyer, as I've mentioned, the Heißmeyer experiments became a synonym for the ethical atrocities, but there was no detailed account really of the experiments and neither of the victims, the names were not known. So the investigators during the Magdeburg trial, I've just mentioned his arrest, so it was followed by the trial in the mid-60s. They actually made, to me, a surprisingly an impressive effort to find the families of the adult victims. Their starting point was the retrieved box, which they got it out of Heißmeyer during the trial, that he had this box and it was buried, so they retrieved it and found all this documentation, including pictures of the victims, which is something very rare, and that they survive. And it contained the documentation for 32 adult test persons and full medical accounts. So the investigators, they really set out to these really remote areas in Russia, Ukraine, and Poland. And these test persons, mostly the victims came from really agricultural backgrounds in remote Russian villages. And they really went out to find these families, and they interviewed the families, often more than one member, and they also asked them to send in pictures. And so we even have the post-war pictures, but they didn't find a living survivor at the trial. And although the families were asked to send in these pictures, there was no media attention in this. It was not given to the media. And so these pictures and all these accounts really they disappeared in the amount of around, I think, 160 trial files, and they were completely forgotten. The investigation did not search for the family of the children because their names were still unknown. They did not come up in the documentation we have from Heißmeyer, and so they were still non-identified. In the West, there was actually little notice taken of the Heißmeyer trial. Nevertheless, in the 60s, so around the same time, an interest evolved in the life stories of the murdered children, not the adults. Okay, It was Franz Brinkmann, a communist prisoner at Neuengamme, who really started investigating into these children's identities, because there was a list by a Danish doctor who had been at Neuengamme, and he had named them, but this testimony had completely been lost for decades, and he looked at this list again and took it as a starting point. This starting point was, of course, followed up by Günter Schwaberg, a Hamburg journalist who intensely researched and reconstructed the biographies of these 20 children. And he also contacted their families, who only then learned about the fate of their children or their brothers and sisters. And he wrote, that's Günter Schwaberg done that, and he wrote various books, and groups started of the relatives to meet yearly and so on. There was no communication evolving, though, between these families who testified before in the trial from the adult victims. It took really until 2001 for a survivor turning up in Hamburg at the memorial, and he had written letters before. Alexander Schoroschun, he had and he's one of the adult victims of the Heißmeyer experiments, and he had kept sending letters to Hamburg until finally a Hamburg historian realized he is actually a survivor. And so, so I started a little project recently that looks into these adult victim files using the material from the trials. And it's really very intense to see if we go from the traces left from Heißmeyer, these perpetrator-designed sources, to the material, the pre-war material, and if one reconstructs the actual biographies of these people. So I come to a conclusion. The story of Heißmeyer is really shaped by the wish to forget, which was epidemic in the post-war era in Germany, on both sides, really. Additionally, the search and persecution of Heißmeyer as the responsible doctor was heavily slowed down by the non-communication between the inner German border. He had been identified in the West as soon as 1945, lived and worked for decades in the East. Authorities had it really easy to turn a blind eye on his past in the East, because the scattered information that made it across the border was easily lost or easy to ignore. And although since 1963 the names of the adult victims were documented, it was the search for mostly West European children which set Günter Schwaberg off. So in a nutshell, the post-war history of Heißmeyer shows dramatically the crucial information on both perpetrators and victims. They were really out in the open for decades, but it took decades for historians and the public to see them and notice them and connect the dots. Thank you.